Hi, this is Michael Waitze, and welcome back to ATP. The adoption of AI in Asia is accelerating, but effective usage isn't just about deploying the latest models. It's about having the right data foundations in place to take advantage of them. However, many businesses still struggle with poor data quality, poor data security, and the constant challenges of data expansion. I wanted to explore whether companies in Asia are really ready for AI deployment at scale. And that's why we invited Adrian Johnson, the VP and General Manager for Asia Pacific at Hitachi Vantara, to help us understand how data governance, partnerships, and talent will help define the future of AI in Asia. Adrian, how are you doing this morning?
I'm great. Thanks, Michael. Great to be on the show with you.
Super great to have you. Let's just jump right in. What are some of the key factors driving AI adoption in Asia?
I think there's a few factors. One is just the economic potential. Fantastic new platform, driving a lot of opportunity. So economic potential is one of them. Competitive advantage. So how do I steal a march on my competition? And I think really the efficiency and effectiveness. How do I introduce efficiency into my business and reduce some of my costs, but at the same time improve my effectiveness?
Got it. Can I ask you this though? Is the adoption different in Asia than it is in the rest of the world? Like, how do these things compare with each other, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. It's interesting. Asia Pac is actually ahead of the rest of the world. So I think we're sort of seeing about 42% of Asian companies are saying that it's something that they're actively adopting, versus 37% across the rest of the world. So there's a much greater push towards AI in Asia, particularly in Singapore and China.
Interesting. And why do you think it's so different? I mean, that's a big percentage jump, yeah?
Yeah, I think part of it is, and I talk about this quite a lot with my own team, is we see Asia Pacific as really the market of the 21st century. And so we see a lot of innovation, there's a lot of competition coming out of this area, there's a lot of developing economies. And so it's really driving forward this push into how to use technology more effectively to compete both within your own market, but how to be more effective globally. And I think Asia has a great opportunity to go do that.
So do you think there's this factor will happen where companies outside of Asia will start looking into Asia and say, hey, they're doing it here better than we're doing it. What can we learn from them? Do you know what I mean?
I think they're going to have to, because this is, you're competing generally now on a global stage. And so any company that is getting an advantage, any country that is getting an advantage, others are going to look at that and say, how do we catch up? And I think Asia is one of those places where we can move very, very quickly. Great depth of talent, great economic opportunity. I think if you can combine those things, then that clearly gives us an advantage.
Were you surprised by DeepSeek? Did I get that right? And just the not the furor, but like the excitement around it, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it was interesting for everybody concerned. Real surprise into the market, and I think it shows how quickly things are changing in this market right now. Was the disruptor got disrupted? It was only sort of a couple of years ago. ChatGPT hits the market, and suddenly everybody understands AI, and we start to talk about, for the first time, here's a tangible example of what AI is capable of. Within a couple of years, the disruptor seems to be disrupted. So I think we all got surprised because the world was moving in a certain direction. Lots of investment in GPUs, companies meeting sort of the $1 trillion market valuation, this being quite a complex undertaking. And then DeepSeek arrives with claims of simplicity, low cost, efficiency, effectiveness. So I think it was one of those, disruptive moments that hit the market.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, right, if you look at the chips that they were using, they're probably not the most powerful chips in the world. And part of the reason, we don't have to talk about the politics of this, right, but part of the reason is because they're inside of China and they don't have access to some of the greatest chip designs in the world, which essentially are done in the United States, even if they're fabbed in Taiwan or somewhere else. It's just interesting to me that they said, what do we have? What can we use? And still, how can we make it better? Yeah, I thought that was kind of cool, no?
It's like necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly.
If you've got restrictions, you have to go do things a little bit differently. But I think that the DeepSeek story is one that's still not fully played out. I think there's a lot of conversation around what's truly happening behind the scenes, but it's an interesting one. And I think it's a great addition to the debate and the conversation and understanding in this emerging technology, what's possible. I think that's really sort of the true opportunity here.
Yeah, and I would submit to you, and again, we'll get off of this in a second, but I would submit to you as well that they probably didn't spend as much money as the guys at ChatGPT did at GPT, right? But they probably spent way more money than they're saying that they did, because it's just not possible to build something that powerful for $6 million or whatever they're saying it costs. Anyway.
Story still to come, I think, on that one, Michael.
Yeah. I can't wait. We'll have to have you back on when that story continues to play out. So we already talked about adoption. What are some of the biggest data infrastructure challenges that companies face when they're deploying all this stuff?
Yeah, I think what's happened is AI has obviously put a burden on existing infrastructure. So the infrastructure was designed to perform a certain task, and AI's now come along and it's putting a lot of compute tasks on it, a lot of storage requirements, a lot of high performance file requirements. And so that infrastructure, which was built, perhaps over the last decade and a half to perform a certain task, is now being stretched. And it's been stretched really hard by the performance requirements of AI. And I think underlying that, obviously, then is the data that is supplying those AI models.
Yeah. So is this different because I think about this a lot, right? Big incumbent companies, big corporations have budgets that are way higher than SMEs have, right? Yeah. But part of the promise of AI, particularly from an automation, but also just from a data organization standpoint, is that SMEs should now be able to level the playing field with big companies. But now they have this data storage and data security and all these other problems that go along with it. How do we balance that out so that the field is not skewed so much towards big companies, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think we're going to see, a continuation of the way people consume IT as it is today. So SMEs will access different forms of compute or IT than, say, the big companies. Big companies can invest in their own people, their own platforms. Some of them can even build their own data centers. And so I think it will see that continue. Where the SMEs will have opportunity is where they access, as a service type models for AI. And so I think we will see really a variety of different options that are available, from the build your own large language model through to I'm just going to go access something that's off the shelf, available on demand, consume as I need. But it's really going to come back to, in many ways, the quality of the data that you're supplying into those models to drive the right outcome. Because I think accuracy and the types of outcomes and recommendations we're seeing from AI are really varying based on the quality of the data. And that's where really the SMEs have that opportunity, is to look at what drives the different outcome here.
Yeah, can I ask you this, though? So how should these companies, both big and small, rethink their data strategies? And because you said this earlier, the infrastructure that they set up 5 years ago, 10 years ago, wasn't meant to be used in the way they're using it, right? Like I used to say, it's like driving a Ford Fairmont when everybody else is driving a Ferrari, right? Now you're in an F1 race and you're like, it's a car, but it's not meant to do this thing, right? How do these strategies need to be rethought, do you think?
Well, I mean, let's be fair to these organizations out there. The amount of data that they are consuming and creating is growing exponentially. And so there was this challenge of, how do I just keep up with the amount of data that's coming into my business? And it's not just that. There's often a governance and a regulatory requirement that's kind of built around that data. So you're having to protect it, you're having to store it. Now you overlay on top of that AI. Now, I think the great opportunity for AI is to actually get value out of all this data. And I think that's probably the exciting part of AI and the data conversation is, for all of these years, we've just been thinking about how do we actually get value out of it. AI shows us how to go do that. But it's the old sort of garbage in, garbage out conversation, is the AI model is only going to be as good as the data and the quality of the data that we can feed it. So we're seeing much greater results from structured data. This kind of data that sits in databases and in data warehouses, well structured against a table. We know the quality of it. We know how it's created. But the vast majority of data that's being created now is unstructured. It's coming from all sorts of different sources and coming
from everywhere.
Right. And so absolutely everywhere. And now you're thinking about, so what's the source? What's the quality? If I feed it into the model, what kind of results is it going to give us? And so that's really both the challenge, but I think equally the opportunity, because it's that unstructured data that you want to get the value out of.
How do I want to think about this? You mentioned LLMs, large language models, right? Specific large language models. I don't think that big companies or small companies want to go out and use the public GPT, right? They want to have their own models running against their own data, and they don't want to share the results with the rest of the world and then have their data training these big LLMs. Do you see a place for kind of like not smaller, but like more nimble, more specific, company specific LLMs that then can go out and analyze your data better than a more generic model could? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if you think of the sort of the analogy here, would you take all of the data that you've got and go give it to someone else and say,
Never.
go take a look at this? Of course you wouldn't. Your customers
Never.
aren't trusting you with are entrusting you with your data not to go do things like that. And so, that extends out into AI. And there's a couple of pieces there. One is the data protection, data governance, data security that you've got to think about. But then equally, then is the economic potential side of this is I want to create a competitive advantage. I want to deliver a better service, a better outcome to my customers. Do I want to then go share that advantage with others? But there's also parts of, I want that LLM to be specific to my industry. I want it to be specific to my organization and the outcomes I'm trying to drive. And so these early iterations of AI have been us really just testing the potential, putting them in some of the open source or openly available models to kind of understand what's possible. Now we're starting to get a greater understanding is we will start to shift more towards these, kind of more protected LLMs, ones where the data that you're putting in, where the data's stored, how it's being protected. And so we started talking about sovereign data in the last several years, the concept of what legal jurisdiction is my data being subject to, so I know, how I can protect it. The next iteration of that is going to be sovereign AI. The AI that sits within my country, my region, is subject to the laws of my country, not somewhere else. And so I think these are all considerations that build into this concept of LLMs and how they get built and how they get used.
Can we talk about the regulatory stuff here? And I'll tell you why. I want to give you some context. This is a while ago now, but I don't think the thought process changed. In 2004, I was sent from Japan to Hong Kong to help rebuild Goldman Sachs' portfolio trading business outside of Japan. And one of the things I learned right away was that this data sovereignty issue was that Korea required you to have your data servers inside Korea because they wanted to make sure that the country could control whatever data was getting created inside that country was created there. But our servers at the time were in Hong Kong. And the first thing I said to my boss in Tokyo was, we got to move those servers like tonight because those issues are real and those regulatory issues are real. How do you see this type of thing developing? Because you're right, if the data has sovereignty issues, but also the AI itself has sovereignty issues, right? How do you see this coming together, particularly in a region like Asia where it's just so diverse and where some economies are developing, some are developed, some are in the middle? How do you see all this stuff playing out?
I think we can learn a lot from some of those data sovereignty laws and the needs and requirements of regulation. Extend that out to AI. The Singapore government has introduced an AI ethics and governance body of knowledge set of rules to guide the ethical use and implementation of AI within organizations in Singapore. And so that's sort of akin or equivalent to what you've just talked about in terms of data servers being stored, being located in a certain country. We will see probably the same thing happen with AI. And so, something that I might do in one country might not be considered ethical or legal in another. And so
exactly,
same concept right around data is we'll apply to AI this idea of how do I use it? What's the ethical application of it? What's acceptable? What's unacceptable? And how we're going to apply that and what laws it's subject to. And particularly in places like highly regulated industries like banking, finance, healthcare, those will often drive, data regulations, which I think will then extend into how we think about AI being used.
So I always think about regulatory convergence, right? So I traded in Japan, and the rules for trading in Japan were completely different than the rules for trading in Greece, let's say, because we had to manage all these markets, right? They were completely different. The market microstructures were different as well. But we're at the early stages out here in Asia, essentially, right? Do you see not data convergence, but regulatory convergence happening at all? Or do you expect it to happen? Maybe being led by the MAS or something that's happening in Singapore, maybe converging with what's going on in Dubai, and then everybody else in the middle just goes, that all makes sense to us. Do you see that happening as well?
I think it's possible. And I think definitely there are examples that we can look backwards and look back in time and say, so what's the model for this? The European Union, implemented GDPR for the governance of data and privacy and regulations and how consumer data was protected and the right for the consumer to determine how their data was used. That
Right.
type of regulatory framework has been adopted around the world. We've seen similar types of laws in Australia. India is considering, the same kind of types of laws around digital data and how it's used. And so those types of examples where someone sort of sets the standard or sets a standard, and if it's in an economy that's large enough, like the European Union, it does have impact around the world, because you can say, if you want to compete in my market, these are the rules that you must be governed by. And we see that, in financial regulations, while you might be governed by your home country, if you want to operate globally, you've got to be consistent with the market that you're then operating in. So I think there are examples, but I think it's also early days, and countries at this stage are still figuring out, I think, their own regulatory framework that obviously then starts to build into what does that look like globally.
So you just reminded me of something. We talked about DeepSeek, right? Developed in a very large economy like China with great educational institutions and a ton of really smart people, right? And we see LLMs being developed in the United States as well. But interestingly enough, and I'm just curious what you think about this, with all the IITs, right, the Indian Institutes of Technology, I have to believe that something's going to bubble out of India as well. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. We've talked about India for many years having this demographic dividend, a very young population that's highly educated, IT literate, and they've been very, very successful in delivering IT services globally, and so you have to think that AI is going to be an extension of some of the capabilities that exist within India being put to use around building some of these types of models. So I'm excited to see what India can bring forward in this space.
So am I. I mean, because India's done a really good job, completely separate topic, but of creating payment rails, right, inside the country. And the creation of those payment rails has now given access to even the smallest merchant for digital payments. And I know those things may not seem related, but it means to me that the government at a really high level is thinking, what else do we need to make our economy more competitive and better? And I wouldn't be surprised if there was some funding going on there for that stuff as well. You mentioned data security earlier. What are some of the risks here, and how should those data security risks be addressed?
So I think as you kind of think about what AI is fueling. It's fueling recommendations. It could be potentially at some point driving decisions, or even making semi-autonomous decisions. And so the protection of the data that's fueling that AI model, but then also the model itself. If it's a source of competitive advantage, it's driving economic potential for your business. The same kinds of concerns around what we've seen around the security of data would apply equally to sort of the AI model, and how we think about what's proprietary, what's intellectual property that we need to protect, but then also the rights and the protection of the consumer that's potentially interacting with that system.
So how can people strike a balance, I guess I would say, between really rapid innovation, rapid iteration and stuff like that, and still being concerned about cybersecurity, the security that we're talking about, right? Because sometimes when you're running really fast, you can leave some holes behind you. How do you balance those two things out? And I have an innovative question for you when you're done.
Okay. I think it starts with making sure you actually have a really well thought out security policy and framework. And so, regardless of, the type of business that you're operating, or what you're contemplating as a new service, there really should be a data policy and security framework that you've adopted that applies equally across your other services to what you're doing in AI. Now, I think AI gives it a slightly different flavor, and there's perhaps some different considerations. But this idea of move fast and break it probably is not something you want to consider with AI. You've got to be a little bit more thoughtful about what you're playing with and the potential implications and consequences of this technology. But I think it starts with, similar to what the Singapore government's done, is to think through the ethical use of AI, the use of knowledge, and how you're going to apply that, and just making sure that you're checking back against that as you implement some of these programs. Because I think the potential is to run really, really fast, but when you break it, the consequences could be a little bit more severe.
Yeah, really severe. So here's something that I thought about this morning before we started recording. And I think it's because I have the largest insurance and insurtech podcast in the world, and I spend so much time talking about insurance, right? Is there an insurance solution to this as well? Do you know what I mean? As you're building, as you're iterating, stuff like that, is there a place to build into the products that you have an insurance angle too, where like, we'll do all this stuff for you and we'll connect you with an insurance provider that can help if there are holes?
Look, I think there is potential for that. I think we've seen some innovative, parts of insurance with things like cybersecurity insurance, as an example.
Yeah.
So that sort of, there's these new sort of offerings. What does that mean from AI, both from a protection standpoint, and an insurance policy against that, but then also how does AI get used within an insurance industry? So I think there's AI is one of those technologies that has the potential to impact not just how it gets used in a certain industry, but how that industry then offers certain protections or certain services back to the use of AI.
Yeah, I mean, look, I can spend hours talking to you and talking to people about how it's a little bit meta, right? But you can use the AI to create products on the fly that are very customized for specific institutions and specific use cases, because now you have access to all this data that you might not have had access to before, and you have the ability to iterate at speed and at scale to come up with new products and say, this is going to be more appropriate. Can I ask you this as well? And again, just for some context, a few weeks ago, I was having a conversation with somebody about quantum computing. And we're not there yet. But how do you think about AI in the context of quantum and then the opportunities that that gives? Because now you have all this extra computing power, right? And your ability to do way more stuff at once.
I think one of the things we've learned early about AI, just the amount of compute capacity it does actually use. So I think anything you can do where you are increasing your access or use of compute is going to be helpful. But I'd balance that with a couple of things. One is cost, the other is sustainability. And I think that's been one of the question marks around AI is how do I do this sustainably at a time when we are trying to become a greener planet? This in many ways increases power consumption. So you've got to make sure that you are, you're doing this responsibly and sustainably. But I think where quantum starts to really give us an opportunity is this convergence of edge data. So everybody walking around with a mobile phone, a wearable, all sorts of data sources that are coming in, your ability to then process and manage and get through just an enormous amount of data sets at scale with quantum, I think is really where we'll see that opportunity really come to the forefront.
I think it's so interesting, right? I'm lucky. I get to talk to so many people like you who run businesses like yours, and all of them, almost to a fault, particularly as the data continues to expand, and not just the use of it, but just the sheer amount of it, have always talked about sustainability, right? Because while AI does give us the ability to automate things, it's very expensive at some level to use, right? Particularly if it's all GPU based, but also data centers are getting bigger. I know a guy who's literally building data centers in space, right? Easier to cool, easier to maintain. You can put them up there. They don't get in anybody's way. They use less power. They're closer to the sun, all these things. But everybody does talk about sustainability, which in my mind is a good thing. Can we also talk about governance? Just data governance at scale and why it's so important. Like what kind of frameworks or best practices should organizations think about?
Yeah, first off, can I just say data centers in space has got to be the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, I know the guy who's doing it. If you want me to introduce you to him, I definitely will. He's a really smart dude.
That's awesome. So it's, data governance is one of those, as we kind of look across AI, the importance of partnerships and building trust is going to be incredibly important. So what we are seeing is an increase in organizations looking to bring AI-specific talent into their organization. So people who do understand the implications and consequences of this technology, but then equally building partnerships with organizations that can bring that type of specific knowledge around how to best govern, protect, and run these models. And I think we're going to see a balance of that, of what in-house capability and talent I'm going to bring in and to develop, but then equally, there's probably going to be a shortage, in the short term as we build these skills. And so the need to build partnerships with companies that specialize in this will help that governance model. But I think we're going to see a blend of that. And we are seeing organizations talk about their increasing hiring in this space for specialist skills.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, and I wrote this down so I reminded myself to say it, but I think no one succeeds alone, right? And I do think that this idea that these partnerships are going to be really important is going to be key. And another thing, you mentioned about talent. Where is all this talent going to come from? And I guess the other part of the question is, because again, we talk so much about automation, right? And I love when people, because I've seen so many different business cycles. Every time a new technology gets introduced, the world goes crazy about like everyone's going to get laid off. Humans are not going to have jobs anymore. And I've heard this like 5 or 6 times in my life. And generally what's happened is humans didn't get laid off. They were just like moved to do something different and actually something better and more effective and more impactful and better for them as well. So I'm just wondering, like, how are companies, because it's still early, where are they going to find the talent and how are they going to train this talent, again, to be sustainable over time?
I think a part of it is going to have to be, a repurposing of talent. So many of the companies I talk to is, no one's giving us any more budget. If you're a CIO, the CFO is not handing over bagfuls of money for you to go solve this. And so part of the equation here is, how do I modernize and make what I've got more efficient so I can free up the talent that is focused on operationally running my business today to be repurposed, retrained, redeveloped into focusing on the AI opportunity. So it's going to be a combination of hiring talent that's hopefully starting to emerge from universities with this type of capability. That talent that we develop as we start to learn more about these models, and those partnerships that I talked about earlier, where companies that are going to emerge with this specialist kind of skill set. And I think to your point, there's that fear of, hey, we're gonna lose jobs. Think of the jobs that get created because of this, and we're talking about that example right now.
Yeah, I mean, even just in the content creation space, the ability to use AI for some of the stuff that we do has been so helpful and so amazing. And that wasn't possible 5 years ago. So nobody lost their job because of it, but guys like I am actually have a job because of it, right? It's hard to explain. Well, I think so. Before I go ahead. No, go ahead.
To say, I think if we think about some of the concepts we talked about, just this enormous amount of data that we're not using. Imagine if we start to apply these AI models to that data. I'm not sure we even understand all of the opportunities that's going to present, but I am excited by the potential.
So what does the future look like to you then? That's what I was going to ask you. Over the next 3 to 6 years, where do you see things going in Asia in particular, but globally as well?
I think there's 2 parts to this. I think one is going to be the opportunity. So is this convergence of all of these data sources that we've talked about and the enormous amount of data that's been created out on the edges. How does that converge with what's already in our data centers and what's already being created within organizations to feed into that AI model and for that to start to really deliver on economic potential? But I think the other side of that then is the regulatory framework that comes alongside that. So I think there's 2 parts really is going to be just the enormous potential that it creates. But for organizations, it's going to be at the same time, how do I stay compliant with what I imagine is going to be a more complex regulatory environment?
Yeah, it's going to have to be more complex because, and I was thinking about this too, when I went to college, which was a while ago now, I feel like the world was more, what's the right thing to say? Like the business environment was just more stable. You kind of knew what you were going to get. So if you studied economics, which I did, I kind of figured that degree was going to be useful for me for the next 10 to 20 years, right? But now I feel like the business landscape just changed so fast, right? So there was no AI business 3 years ago before ChatGPT was announced, right? So even universities are going to struggle, I think, to keep up with just this pace of innovation and their ability to train people. And I think what's going to end up happening is it's going to be this private-public partnership between universities and companies that already exist that need people to do these things. And they're going to have to train them to do it better. Anyway, I really appreciate your time today. Adrian Johnson, the VP and General Manager for Asia Pacific at Hitachi Vantara. You were awesome. I really appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.
Thanks, Michael. It's been great. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you very much.